in the shadow of one of history's darkest regimes. Every detail was carefully crafted, every image meticulously designed. The Nazi regime understood the power of appearance. Uniforms that commanded fear, obedience, and unwavering loyalty. But behind the sharp lines and iconic symbols was a man and a company that helped weave this terrifying vision into reality. Hugo Ferdinand Boss, the founder of what would become a global fashion empire, began his career as a tailor in the Weimar Republic. Yet his company's fortunes changed dramatically when it became the official supplier of Nazi uniforms. This is the story of how Hugo Boss's sewing machines stitched the fabric of tyranny, how fashion became an instrument of propaganda and oppression. Hugo Ferdinand Boss was born in 1885 in Metzingen, a quiet town nestled in the rolling hills of southern Germany. The son of a soap manufacturer, Boss didn't follow his father's footsteps. Instead, he pursued the needle and thread. He trained as a merchant and later completed an apprenticeship in tailoring. Like many young men in the post-imperial era, Boss saw promise in building something of his own. In 1924, just after Germany emerged from the chaos of World War I and the collapse of the Kaiser's empire, Hugo Boss launched his own clothing company. His factory produced practical garments, workwear, uniforms for postal and railway workers, and everyday civilian coats. It was a difficult time. The Weimar Republic was a nation in crisis, crippled by war reparations, political violence, and soaring hyperinflation. But Hugo Boss weathered the storm. His business model was simple: produce durable, affordable garments in large quantities. By the end of the 1920s, his factory employed dozens of workers and was slowly gaining traction. But something darker was brewing across Germany. As social unrest grew and extremist ideologies gained followers, the country drifted toward the far right. The Nazi Party, once dismissed as fringe radicals, was becoming a political force, and for businesses like Hugo Boss's, aligning with the right people could mean survival and success. In 1931, 2 years before Hitler seized power, Hugo Boss joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. It was a decision that would not only ensure government contracts but entangle his company in the machinery of fascism. Hugo Boss had built a tailoring business, but soon he would be dressing an army that would march the world into war. As the 1930s began, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party was no longer a fringe movement. Fueled by mass unemployment, anger at the Treaty of Versailles, and nationalist fervor, it was rapidly gaining ground across Germany. But this was more than just a political revolution. It was a visual one. Hitler and his inner circle understood that symbols, colors, and uniforms were vital tools of influence. Uniforms became a visual language of power, an identity imposed on millions. A man in uniform was no longer just a man. He was part of something bigger, something terrifying. It began with the SA, or Sturmabteilung, Hitler's paramilitary street force. Known as the Brown Shirts, they wore simple tan tunics and leather belts, modeled after World War I uniforms and colonial attire. To supporters, they represented order. To opponents, they were violent thugs. But they were unmistakable, and that was the point. As Hitler climbed toward power, the Nazi Party's obsession with style grew deeper. Every uniform element, every button, braid, and color was engineered to intimidate. The swastika was not just a symbol, it was a brand. The Nazis were building a new German identity, and like any brand, it needed a uniform. By 1932, a new force emerged from within the Nazi Party, the SS, or Schutzstaffel, elite, loyal, uncompromising, and terrifying in appearance. The SS uniform was the brainchild of two men, Karl Diebitsch, an SS officer and artist, and Walter Heck, a graphic designer. Together they created one of the most chilling images of the 20th century. The design was militaristic, futuristic, and ruthless. Black wool, silver piping, and the Totenkopf, the skull insignia borrowed from German death squads. It wasn't just fashion, it was psychological warfare. And it wasn't just the SS. The Hitler Youth, German Labor Front, NS Frauenschaft, and other branches all had their own distinct uniforms. The entire society was being dressed for indoctrination. Uniforms weren't made for comfort. They were made to erase individuality. Every stitch reinforced ideology. Every thread served the Reich. And now that the designs were complete, the regime needed manufacturers, skilled tailors who could mass-produce military elegance on an industrial scale. In 1931, Hugo Ferdinand Boss was a businessman with ambition. His company, still relatively small, was producing uniforms for mailmen, firemen, and railway workers. But Germany was changing, democracy was crumbling, and Hugo Boss made a decision that would secure his financial future, but leave a moral debt that could never be repaid. That year, he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, membership number 5,088,890. At the time, the Nazis had not yet taken power. Boss didn't join them under pressure, he joined them in anticipation. As Hitler's movement gained momentum, uniforms became central to the Nazi image. The SA, the original paramilitary wing of the party, needed brown shirts by the thousands. The SS, still a fringe elite, needed their iconic black uniforms tailored. The Hitler Youth needed to look sharp. It was a regime dressed for conquest. Boss's company began receiving government orders for uniforms, first for the SA and SS, then for the Hitler Youth, and later even for the Wehrmacht. These weren't small contracts. Boss's factory became one of the primary civilian producers of Nazi uniforms. Boss expanded his workforce and production lines. By 1938, his small-town factory had transformed into a booming operation backed by the Reich. The Nazi obsession with visual perfection extended to the very thread. The black SS uniform, designed by Karl Diebitsch and Walter Heck, became a feared symbol of elite power. But designing was only half the battle. The uniforms needed to be produced with precision. Hugo Boss delivered. His factory tailored the SS look with crisp lines, silver accents, and militaristic authority. While Diebitsch and Heck were credited with the design, it was Boss's factory that brought the aesthetic to life. From children to commanders, the Nazi state assigned identities through uniforms. To be dressed by the Reich was to be absorbed by it, and Hugo Boss helped clothe that machinery. These weren't just clothes, they were costumes of control, fabricated by industry, stitched with complicity. By the early 1940s, the war had begun. Germany's military expansion meant more orders, more labor, more uniforms. Boss's company was now producing not just for ideology, but for an empire at war. In 1941 alone, Hugo Boss reported a 250% increase in revenue compared to pre-war levels. Business was booming, but as the Reich grew in power, it demanded more than just loyalty. It demanded labor. To keep up with demand, the Boss factory turned to a new workforce, one that didn't volunteer, one that didn't speak, one that wouldn't be remembered in company brochures. The price of profit was paid in silence and suffering. As Nazi Germany marched across Europe, the factories behind the front lines grew louder, but inside the town of Metzingen, the rhythmic sound of sewing machines masked something far darker. Hugo Boss's uniforms no longer came from the hands of paid German workers. They were now sewn by prisoners, by forced laborers, by the conquered. With the war in full swing, German men were sent to the front lines. Labor shortages hit every sector. The regime's solution? Import labor, not through offers, but through orders. By 1940, the Nazi government began reallocating prisoners of war, political prisoners and civilians from occupied territories into Germany's industrial heart, and Hugo Boss's factory was among those that welcomed them. Between 1940 and 1945, Boss's Metzingen facility employed between 140 and 200 forced laborers, primarily women from Poland and France. Many were teenagers. Most spoke no German. None had a choice. Inside the Boss factory, conditions were brutal. Workers labored 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Food was scarce. Barracks were unheated. Surveillance was constant. They were part of a system, not just exploited, but dehumanized. Nazi racial ideology saw Slavic and Eastern European workers as inferior. Boss's factory didn't just benefit from this, it depended on it. Every uniform stitched under duress was a quiet testament to this machinery of cruelty. Uniforms made by people stripped of their names, stripped of their rights, stripped of their futures. In 1945, the Nazi regime fell. The war ended, but justice moved slowly. Hugo Boss was among thousands of German businessmen investigated for wartime conduct. He was fined and temporarily banned from running his company, but he was never imprisoned. Boss claimed he had no real choice, that he was simply a businessman trying to survive under a dictatorship. But documents, contracts, and profits told a different story. He died 3 years after the war ended. He never issued a public apology. He never met the women who labored in his factory, but their stories endured. In 1999, under international pressure, the company publicly acknowledged its role in the Nazi war economy. Hugo Boss AG joined a German industry fund to compensate former forced laborers, decades too late, but still necessary. They weren't just hands on a sewing machine. They were daughters, mothers, survivors,